Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The war-torn country of Yemen is seen by analysts as a territory of limited strategic value, with some ability to threaten vital shipping lanes in the adjacent Red Sea. And while local groups are vehemently fighting for control over this impoverished territory, the conflict is not only an internal one, rather, it is part of a regional struggle factoring in Iran, Saudi Arabia, and even Turkey. To analyze the complexity of this war-ridden country, we're joined from Helsinki, Finland by Atte, who is a Finnish parliament member. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here, Jonathan.
Absolutely. Also joining us all the way from the United Kingdom is Colonel retired Richard Kemp, who is a former British commander and head of the International Counter-Terrorism Intelligence Team at the British Cabinet Office. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
It's a pleasure. Nice to see you again. Both of you.
Absolutely. And of course, here in the studio is our TV7 analyst, editor-at-large, host of Watchmen Talk, Powers in Play, and so much more, Mr. Amir. Oren, Amir, give us a broader understanding on the current state of play in this country of Yemen.
So, Jonathan, one recalls the old line about Mexico being so far from God, so close to the United States. And in Yemen's case, it is so far from Allah and so close to Iran and other countries around it that its internal problems and divisions are, of course, being multiplied by the fact that its many neighbors and even other powers are interested in what is happening inside it. So if in the 1960s we had a coalition of Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, Israel in a clandestine way, and other Western powers supporting the so-called royalists at the time, and Nasser's Egypt supporting the rebels, now we have a similar coalition of Saudi Arabia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and as you said, Oman, the UAE, and Israel behind the scenes against Iran as the major backer of the Houthis. And of course, there are problems because Oman is backing a separatist group. And you can see divisions between north and south, and then west and east. And there are problems that Israel sees, of course, in the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. So if the Houthis keep control of the port of Hodeidah, and if another group will take over the port of Aden, and the Gulf of Aden will become as dangerous as some of the parts of the Red Sea are, then Israel cannot tolerate this problem. As we saw only a week ago or so, Israel's president, Yitzhak Herzog, visited the Emirates when the third strike in a row against the Emirates or a Western American-held base took place. It's dangerous for Israelis now, even though 250,000 Israelis already visited Dubai and the other Emirates in the year and a half since the Abraham Accords were signed. So again, it could be a launching pad against Israel, much as it was against Saudi Arabia. And we in Israel must keep an eye on what is happening in a country which seems to most Israelis very far and very desolate.
Indeed. However, the conflict in Yemen is a conflict of many layers, with the maritime sphere, of course, being at least attempted to be protected by the U.S. Fifth Fleet, alongside also the British Navy and other navies that are making extensive efforts to ensure some of the most robust shipping lanes on a commercial side from the east westward to Europe and elsewhere. And then we look into the regional sphere. We see Iran, we see Saudi Arabia, as Mr. Oren stated, and going down into the power struggles of the multiple tribes aligning themselves with the different positions currently at play. And I'd like to ask you, Mr. Kaleva, as somebody who actually, prior to your political career, studied extensively, also under your service in the military, the various elements related to the situation in Yemen, going to Yemen and researching from the ground and coming to a point where you were even, together with your wife, kidnapped by a specific tribe who then went and handed you over, of course, sold you and your wife to Al-Qaeda. You've been there in captivity for 4 months or even longer than that, and then ultimately, thank God, got out of there. What is your experience from this Yemeni arena, going down to the most challenging elements of the tribal wars, the tribal allegiances, the fiscal interests of the various tribes, and then, of course, we'll discuss the other layers at hand to try and understand it from a more broader perspective.
Yeah, Jonathan, you're right. Yemen is a very complex society, and it's, I mean, the Romans used to call it Arabia Felix, meaning the happy or the fertile Arabia, but it's not very happy nowadays. I mean, the poor people, the local people, first of all, I have to say I feel so sorry for them because they are the ones who are suffering the most, as it's the case normally in all the big conflicts. But coming to the Yemeni sort of interweb of tribes, of social status, you have the north and west, like you said, that's still prominent, the division. And then, of course, you have the Islamic extremism, and you have the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And then, of course, you have to some extent, there was some, I mean, not when I was in captivity, but afterwards, there was some ISIS or IS presence. More or less, people went and tried to affiliate themselves with the Daesh or the ISIS. But when I was there in 2012, 2013, 4.5 months in captivity, it was funny to see how not funny, but it was interesting to see how the people who actually held me, the Al-Qaeda operatives, how they had these different sort of, their loyalty was not only to Al-Qaeda, but also, of course, to their tribes and to their respective tribes. But first and foremost, I think what we need to understand is that the operatives considered themselves to be pious Muslims. So the Al-Qaeda members clearly had an idea that they were pious Muslims. They were fighting in the path of Allah, and the jihad that they were waging was actually a way for them to sort of showcase their piousness.
Indeed. I'd like then to go to the aspect of the various alliances. Of course, the Houthi tribe, which used to be quite a poor northwestern tribe on the border of Saudi Arabia, managed to, with the help, if I may add, of the RGC, the Islamic Republic of Iran, its Islamic Revolutionary Guards and Quds Force, nowadays even with Hezbollah operatives flown to there from Lebanon and Syria to try and train them on drone warfare and ballistic warfare, have been somewhat able to conquer additional lands, which then correlates to alliances with additional tribes, alliances with other families and groups, that then provided it with quite the substantive power in order to make the gains that it has managed to achieve throughout this period of time. And I'd like to ask you, Colonel Kemp, when we're looking from a maritime perspective, the port of Hodeidah, the various significant ports that Mr. Oren spoke about earlier, to what degree is the Royal Navy, which is one of the most active, if not the most active, in trying to protect commercial shipping in that area, successful on the one hand, and then concerned on the other from the Iranian presence there that obviously grants Tehran quite the leverage versus the UAE, versus Saudi Arabia, and versus the West on many elements?
Yeah, the Royal Navy has been, alongside the US fleet there, has been successful to some extent in deterring further attacks. We obviously don't know how many attacks were planned and that were deterred by naval ships in that region. But clearly, it is a concern. It's a concern both from the perspective of a potential attack by Iran, by the IRGC's navy, but also operating in the region, in the area of Yemen, there is a concern about attacks from the Houthis. And of course, you know, as has been mentioned, the Houthis are supported extensively financially, in weapons terms, in training, and various other forms of backing by Iran. They have the capability of firing at ships at sea, and they indeed engaged and damaged a US vessel a few years ago. They fired at 2 US naval ships, which managed to deflect the missiles, the anti-ship missiles that were fired at them. And so that threat continues. It was met, of course, with airstrikes by the US in retaliation. But that threat continues and risks, of course, dragging the US and also the Royal Navy into the fight at sea. They're also, the British still, the Americans in the past, the British still are very supportive on land of the Houthi alliance that's going on, particularly supporting with weapons and munitions and expertise the Saudis. Perhaps we can talk about that more in a bit, but it's the Houthis are a very capable organization, and when you add the threat they pose to the direct threat from Iran, I think it's, you know, naval operations in that area are very serious.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, it's quite interesting to hear, of course, the dynamic and the piousness, or the perceived piousness, of those al-Qaeda operatives who are as much loyal to al-Qaeda as they are to their tribes, usually even more loyal to their tribes because of the blood affiliation, which blood has quite the significance in the Arabian culture. But if we truly look at the various elements at play, we see many different streams playing factors here, whether it's Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, that of course is quite significant in certain parts of that area, but also the Shiite dominance that was projected with the Houthis and with Iranian finance and support, then granted them the ability to forge alliances that granted them the edge. To what degree do you see this current complexity being utilized more and more by regional actors? We see also Turkey playing a bigger role in that country, of course now diminished because of the UAE and various administrative deals that they made in that area of Shauba. Do you see this going one step further and conflagrating to a new scale?
Well, it's very complex because, as you said, yes, the Houthis are Shiites, but it's apparently another stream of Shiites than the Iranians. So while they may converge against the Sunnis, they may be different within the Shia. So when one looks at the history of Yemen for the last 60 years or so, after, and this is not to blame Colonel Kemp personally, but after Britain left east of Aden, and there was a vacuum which gave rise to the UAE and other nations, new tribal nations there. One is not certain whether Yemen is really one nation, two nations, three nations glued together. We all remember that there was a time, quite a long time, when there were two Yemens. Then they reunited. Perhaps the conflict will only end when they split two ways, perhaps three ways, with Aden becoming a sort of a separate entity. So yes, into that morass, great powers and lesser powers try to intervene.
Indeed. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Kaleva, to what degree do you see Yemen strategically placed and playing a key factor in the latest developments in the whole rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran?
That's a very good question, Jonathan. And it's first of all, I'd like to comment. I was in Aden in 2012, or like you say, Aden in English language. And there were people there who were still looking back at the English times and saying, oh, they very much hoped that the British would come back and take over Aden and rule. And they said, maybe just for half a year, and then everything would be okay.
You know, in Israel, they also wish for the British to come back. Some Israelis half-jokingly say so.
But I mean, there's so many layers and so many divisions within the country, and if you can even call it a country. But it's like you said, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is of course, it's not just about the Sunni and the Shia Islam. It's also about who will be the local sort of superpower of this area. And Saudi Arabia naturally feels cornered because now you have Houthis in the south, in Yemen. Then you have they are very afraid in Saudi Arabia of the insurgency and the uprisings that were taking place in, for example, Bahrain, which is a Shia dominant but Sunni-led island. And they are super afraid of Iranian dominance or Iranian influence in Dammam area, which is the Saudi area along the Persian or the Arabian Gulf, as they call it, because that's where all the oil is. So they don't want Iran to incite this kind of revolutionary ideas within the Shia community within Saudi Arabia. And this is causing them a lot of headache. And this Iran is like you said, the Houthis are of course Zaidists, the Zaidi version of Shia Islam. But Iran has never been too picky about who gets to be a Shiite and who not, because of course, the Alawites in Syria are considered Shia enough for Iran because Iran is furthering its own agenda through the Alawites, through the Zaidi Houthis. So this kind of rivalry is definitely there. And the Saudis said in a statement that if Iran gets the nuclear bomb, then the Saudis will, in a matter of months, they will get their own bomb. So it's also what makes them sort of strange bedfellows with the Israelites with Israel. The friendship with Saudi and Israel is, of course, the common enemy that you have in Iran.
Indeed. Colonel Kemp, of course, after shaking your head in acquiescence to reasserting British dominance in the region, I'd like to ask you in all practical aspects, to what degree should we be concerned about the developments in Yemen, considering, of course, the various factors being at play on a regional but also on a global scale? We see much more involvement in this aspect. We also can remember quite keenly the designation of Ansar Allah, or the Arabic term for the Houthis, by the Trump administration, and then in a matter of days or weeks, then the Biden administration decided to revocate this designation under the classification that defining the Houthis as a terrorist entity ultimately harms the humanitarian conditions of the countries, because they basically control the entire country and all resources coming into there, which would then thwart the humanitarian aid from entering the country. Is there a way of solving this problem?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm very grateful that Amir did not blame me personally for the entire situation. I'm also willing at any time to return to Yemen or Israel to take over again in both countries. And indeed, I'm returning to Finland in a couple of weeks' time. So happy to re-exert British hegemony wherever I can. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a grave mistake by President Biden, among many grave foreign policy errors that he's made since becoming president, to revoke the prescription, as we call it in Britain, or the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist entity. And his stated reason for doing that was that it would ease the delivery of humanitarian aid. As you say, the Houthis control most of the country. But in my view, the real reasons behind it were not so much that. The first reason, I think, was that he was very determined, as he still is, in his quest to re-establish the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, to do nothing to alienate Iran, in fact, to appease Iran. I think the designation of the Houthis was a part of that appeasement. And the other reason, I think, that he he took that move was purely and simply because President Trump had been the one that brought it in, and he was at the time in the process of pretty much overturning everything he could that President Trump had achieved. I think the designation should be re-established, and there is move, I think, now in the US Congress to try and bring that about. It should be done for a number of reasons. One, because it does send a message to Iran of strength rather than weakness. Weakness, I think, since President Biden took office, his particular brand of weakness has not achieved anything anywhere, particularly in relation to negotiations on the nuclear deal. So he does need to try another path. So I think that should be done. Secondly, removing the designation was effectively giving a concession to the Houthis without anything in return. And if there is ever going to be any kind of a peace negotiation involving the Houthis and other elements within Yemen and maybe with external countries, then the sort of label of terrorist is something that could form part of that negotiation. So I think it's important that he does that. We've seen since the removal of the designation, we have seen a renewal of aggression by the Houthis. So it hasn't achieved anything in that respect. And as far as humanitarian aid is concerned, the designation can remain in place. And as President Trump did, it is possible for the Biden administration to give license to business providers and human rights groups, NGOs, to deliver aid and deliver products to Yemen that they very, very badly need without interference. Yes, it does create extra bureaucracy for the groups that are involved in delivering aid, but I think that's a price worth paying for making it absolutely clear what the reality is of the Houthis. And, there's no question they are a terrorist group. They have carried out terrorist attacks against American shipping. They have also, as we've seen, they've captured American hostages in Yemen. So they are terrorists, and that of course is on top of the real atrocities they carry out day in and day out in Yemen, murdering, torturing, executing in large numbers, stealing humanitarian aid that's delivered for the people that really need it, stealing it for their own resources, which is one of the main sources of funding.
And of course also firing deliberately on civilian and commercial infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates and elsewhere. And of course, with the first attack on the UAE just 4 weeks ago, claiming the lives of four nationals, including 2 Indians. But Mr. Kaleva, you would like to add on that?
Yes, I fully agree with what Richard Kemp said. I was just in Dubai for the World Expo 2020, and I was there when the missiles allegedly came and hit Abu Dhabi, and also some of them were aimed at Dubai, but apparently they were shot down by the UAE air defense. But this kind of behavior is totally unacceptable. Like firing missiles at Israel is totally unacceptable by the Palestinians, and also this kind of behavior must not be tolerated. And appeasement doesn't work. It never works with dictators who have a tendency of being totally ruthless, with complete disregard of human rights and the rule of law. So what we actually need now in the Middle East, regarding not only the Houthis but also Iran, is I think we need a little bit more Churchill than Chamberlain. And this is a problem that I don't see in the Biden administration. I didn't see it in the Obama administration either, that this kind of striking deals with Iran, which are no deals actually, which are just there, a piece of paper to say that, okay, this is peace for our time. It doesn't work. It never has worked, and it never will work. So this kind of appeasement policy, it's I don't know why the Biden administration doesn't see it for themselves.
Indeed. Well, I don't think we had any program with so much praise to the British Empire, but let's, as we're drawing near to the end of the program, and the fact of the matter is, and the message is clear, appeasing terrorist organizations that are willing to take the extra mile that goes beyond the norms and values of Western societies, of societies that do not recognize deliberate attacks as a legitimate means to achieve anything. We see here a current situation in which Ansar Allah, or the Houthis, are building up their coalition with additional internationally recognized terror groups, be it Hezbollah, be it the Islamist Hamas organization, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Various organizations are stepping up and openly saying, we're going to stand with you, we're going to bolster this, and the reference made to the agreement, be it an opponent or a proponent of this deal, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, billions of dollars into Iranian coffers will exacerbate the situation in Yemen. What can you tell us? To what degree can we focus on this piece of territory, be it as strategic as it may be?
Well, it's hard to imagine the Yemenite population who are so poor and are eking out their existence. They were at one time called the Scots of Arabia because they had to work under very, very dire conditions in order to exist. It's hard to see them getting any money out of these billions which you are referring to. Obviously, it will only go to weapons and perhaps to some corrupt leaders. And one should add to the factors which you listed, politics too, because former President Saleh changed his allegiance more than once and therefore complicated the situation.
Well, the situation there is indeed complex, and we'll focus on the situation more often to try and understand the complexities that it also then exports to neighboring countries and the region at large. But I'd like to thank Colonel Kemp, Mr. Kaleva, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.